Hello everyone, my name is Code Gorilla, and today I'll be presenting a speedrun of Anodyne 2 Return to Dust, the 80% route. Anodyne 2 was published in 2019 by Analgesic Productions on Steam, and as of February 2021 is available on all consoles as well. For this run, I'm going to be playing the PC version, although the choice of console doesn't actually impact the speedrun at all, it's just what's easiest for me to record. I'm recording this commentary after the fact so that I can have a good commentated run for the purposes of submitting to Summer Games Done Quick 2021 and maybe other marathons in the future, but also just to have something to point to people. It's like, here's me explaining this entire run. Yeah, I just think it'll be useful to have that going forward. Couple of things before we get started. I want to warn you about one particular trick we use in this run called pause gliding. I'll describe what that means once we're actually into the run, but in terms of the reason I'm bringing it up is it involves rapidly pausing and unpausing the game, so there's rapidly cycling screens. If you have any sort of photosensitivity to that, I will warn you as those sections come up, and we'll warn you we'll let you know when they've gone away, so you can turn away from the screen, don't hurt yourself watching this speedrun. It's a minor thing, but I believe in an abundance of caution on that regard. Other things about this run: the current world record for this category at the time of recording is 1:17:35, held by me. I've given an estimate for submitting purposes of an hour and a half just to be safe, but realistically, like, a sub 120 is pretty reasonable. Plus, some time to set up the settings, and also, if you want to watch the credits at the end and do post-run verification, I'm going to be doing that in this recording, but that's not necessary for a marathon setting, obviously. So with that out of the way, let's get into the settings. So there's a couple of settings that are important. First, the community requires for your speedrun to be valid, you have to have invincibility off, double health off, and 60 FPS lock on. Then the other settings that I want to go by, first of all, there's camera speed 150%. I'll explain why that one's important later in the run, but just know that we do want it set to 150%. Then there's save when overlap 2D checkpoint. We want that on. It's an important safety feature so that you get an automatic save and free heal every time you just walk over a checkpoint. And then finally, a set of dialogue related options. We want show text immediately on, we want skip dialogue on, and we want the language to be simplified Chinese. There's a lot of text in this game, and those three settings allow it to pass by very quickly, and means you also don't need to mash through text either. It just goes by very quite fast. With all of that out of the way, we'll go ahead and get started now. On 3, 2, 1, go. So right off the bat, we have a quick cutscene skip. We're going to hold 8 o'clock on the control stick, and we're going to mash jump as we come out of this cutscene to jump out of a cutscene trigger for a second longer cutscene right away, and just be able to start playing immediately. So the basic concept behind the game is you're traveling and exploring these 3D landscapes to find characters to talk to and use your powers to shrink down and go inside them, where you find these 2D Zelda-esque areas. So the basic concept is you explore in 3D, then you do these these like more linear action sections in 2D, and then you come back out to 3D and you repeat. First, we have a set of tutorial areas here that are all pretty short, but give you a basic idea of the general mechanics of the game. Your primary weapon for this game is a vacuum cleaner. So you'll see me pick up various blocks and enemies by sucking them up with the vacuum cleaner, and then you spit them back out to destroy other things. We'll get a pretty basic example of that right here, where we shoot these blocks into these enemies. Great. Something to note about the movement in this game is you move slower when you have anything in your tank, when you've inhaled anything. So frequently you'll see me get right up against something before I inhale it and then spit it out almost immediately. Basically, we want to minimize that movement with something in the tank as much as possible. Another important thing about this run is dust routing. So there's this collectible dropped by enemies called dust. At various points in the run, we need to have a certain amount of dust in our tank and in our storage. So that bar you see on the left side of the screen right now is how much dust we currently have. We need to keep careful track of that and make sure that we get enough. The key thing is dust drops from enemies are RNG based. So you kind of have to do a bunch of routing on the fly, making sure that you have enough dust. This room, for example, all 3 enemies dropping dust there is pretty good. I will note specific moments where it's important to have specific amounts. Coming up here is the first instance of that glitch I mentioned, pause gliding. Whenever one of these is coming up, I will give a warning. I'll just say pause glide incoming, and then I'll say pause glide done. So the way it works is whenever you pause the game resets your horizontal and vertical momentum. So by doing that, you can extend one of your glides and actually cover a much greater horizontal distance by repeatedly pausing and unpausing. It's not quite a mash pause, there's a specific rhythm to pausing and unpausing for a pause glide, and it's different for every pause glide in the game because it's all based on how much horizontal distance you have to cover versus how much vertical height you have to give up. This one is very short, it's only 3 pauses long. There's some other ones later in the run that are much longer. Coming up next, we have another really short 2D section that has our first boss of the run. So there are a set of 5 bosses called Nano Assassins that are the bosses of the first 5 2D areas. They all work pretty much the same, where they move around the room in a fixed pattern and you have to hit them a certain number of times. It is possible to skip some of these bosses. And you will see that with 2 of the later bosses. It's actually theoretically possible to skip this one as well. However, if you skip it, you miss out on a cutscene trigger that ends up soft locking your game like 20 minutes down the line. So we have to actually fight this boss, but it does not take very long to fight it. So now we can get to the core gameplay loop of this game, where we're exploring in 3D to find the 2D areas. At the end of each 2D area, there's a dust crystal and a card. And the goal is to get enough cards and enough dust to fill this prism in the middle of the city with dust, and then use that to unlock new areas to explore in 3D. Here we get introduced to the concept of ride scale. So in most of the 3D areas of this game, you can actually transform into a car, and moving as a car is much faster than moving as a person, so you'll see me transform into a car quite a bit. If there's ever a 3D section where you don't see me turn into a car, just assume that I'm not able to, because it's always faster. Now we have the first of our first loop of 2D sections, Mysterio Weisel. So to enter each of these 2D sections, we have this short rhythm minigame. You just have to hold the D-pad in the direction of these colored crystals coming at you to block the shots. Pretty straightforward, not much to comment on. So, an important thing I mentioned earlier is you need dust. An important aspect of this run is dust routing. For the end of the first 4 2D sections, we need 100 dust. And we want to be able to get that without having to go out of our way to grind it. So I'm keeping track of how much dust I have in my tank at all times. The crystal that you get at the end of each of the sections is worth 12, so you do some mental math to figure out, okay, how close am I to my targets? The other important thing to note about dust routing is your tank right now holds 60 dust. You need 100 by the end of these sections, which means you have to go turn in dust at the prism in the middle at least once. So routing that in is part of the challenge of the speedrun. Mysterio Weisel here has a gimmick of these baby slimes that you can see in various parts, where if any of them die for any reason, it actually throws up a gate that blocks your progress. So your challenge in these rooms is figuring out how to kill certain enemies without killing any of the baby slimes, or without letting them accidentally get killed by other enemies, because enemies have friendly fire in this game, as it turns out. There's actually a room coming up with the baby slimes where the fastest thing to do is use the baby slime as an ammunition to kill the enemy we need to kill, which opens a gate, but closes another gate. Then reset the room, which leaves the gate we needed open, but resets the closed gate. So, just like that. Now we have our first actual boss skip. So the key to the boss skip is, before you fully enter the room, you just need to shoot something at the boss. And if you enter the room while the boss is being hit by something and is in its hit animation, it won't trigger the text and you'll be able to walk right out of the room. And it takes longer to explain than it does to actually perform, so we're already way past it now. Coming up next, we have Brand Maligdan. Brand Maligdan is the most precise / difficult of the first loop of 2D areas, in my opinion. Its main gimmick to it is fire. There's burning slimes, there's fire shooters that will light slimes on fire, and then you have some ice slimes that will put out fires, so it's all about balancing that. Because there's a bunch of fire shooters in it, it's also heavily cycle-based, so you have these shooters that shoot on a fixed pattern. They always start at the same spot in the cycle when you enter their room for the first time. So if you just know what's coming, you can predict exactly how they're going to shoot and when they're going to shoot. We use that a lot to get some very fast cycles in some of these rooms. The other thing I want to note here is, for dust routing, we need to get 50 dust by the end of this dungeon to make sure we'll have enough to go turn in, which means we need to have 38 dust by the time we get to the crystal. Obviously, in this particular run, that's not even close to a problem. We came into Brand Maligdan with 37 already, so getting to 38, trivial. But getting some extra dust helps with the next section, so you still see me pick up some dust here. Coming up here is a one cycle room where you move very quickly to get the very first shot the shooter shoots to actually light the gate out of the room on fire. It's pretty precise, but it's not too hard to reproduce once you know what you're doing. Other than that, there's not a whole lot to say about this particular 2D area. It's mostly just performing it as intended. It is faster to tank the hits here than try to actually put out the fires like you're supposed to. The boss here is theoretically skippable, but the positioning is sub-pixel perfect, so it's not really practical to hit in a run, which is why you don't see me even really go for it. Because you have to do it very quickly to actually save time, because the boss goes by pretty quickly. So we now need to go turn in dust. So we're going to do another pause glide here. So pause glide warning. Pause glide done. And this goes back to how I mentioned we need to turn in dust at least once. Now is the right time to turn in dust. Right now the prism in the middle can only hold 50 dust, so we'll have a little bit of dust left over in our tank. That also makes the math easy, because it means we know we need exactly 50 dust in our tank at the end of the next two areas. So to get to Gustine Papillum, who is our next 3D target, you're supposed to climb on top of some shelves and then do some platforming around a bunch of awnings. But it turns out from the very beginning, you can skip to the very end with a very short pause glide. Pause glide incoming. Pause glide done. You can actually do it without a pause glide, but it's less consistent, in my opinion. And with that, we're into Gustine Papillum. Of course, we have another rhythm minigame here. The gimmick in this next section are these tongue levers. You'll get a better idea of what I mean once we actually get in, but basically you pull on them with your vacuum and it causes various tongues to retract or extend. You can use them to ram into enemies to damage them, which we do in a couple of spots. That said, this dungeon is mostly just done as intended, so not a whole lot to commentate on. Again, we're keeping an eye on how much dust we have. It's worth noting that there are fixed spots of dust that don't come from enemies that are always going to be there and always going to give the same amount of dust, so we make sure to route in a healthy amount of that to reduce the RNG in the run. Plus there's just a bunch of these that are basically free and on the way. Sadly, we cannot skip this boss. It's, of the Nano Assassin bosses, it's the one we'd most like to skip because it's the one that takes the longest, but it's also just actually completely impossible to skip. There's no way to... You can get a block before you cross the line, but because of the tongue in the middle of the arena, you cannot shoot the boss before the battle starts. We're going to come out of here with 31 dust, which is pretty good. We need to get to 38 before we get to the next dust crystal, which means we'll need to get 7 between enemies and placed dust in the next section, which is called Great Guam. Now I'm going to introduce the other main glitch used in this run, called ride scale clipping. So the way ride scale clipping works, when you turn into a car, your hitbox is bigger than it is as a person. And if you're up against a wall, you'll get pushed back from the wall to not get clipped into that forward wall. But if you're jammed up in a corner and you rotate the camera just right, you'll get pushed into the other wall and clip straight through it. We use that in a few places to basically save a bunch of time that would be spent. In this case, you would have to navigate a small maze to get to Great Guam here. We're going to use it again to get back out of Great Guam's area so we can skip the maze again. In any case, here's Great Guam. We're going to, again, rhythm minigame. The gimmick, such as it is in this area, are these mole enemies that are called mini-guams. They are buried under the ground, and then if you walk over them, they will pop their heads up. At that point, you can suck them up with your vacuum cleaner and spit them out at things. It's not a very strong gimmick. Honestly, this area is more about the visual gimmicks. You will see me pick up a little bit of extra dust here because it does carry over into Loop 2, so it doesn't hurt to have a little bit of extra. I'm not in any danger of completely filling my tank, which is where it would start to actually waste time. The top half of this 2D area has these dark rooms, and the idea behind these dark rooms is you can't see anything, but the dark rooms are exact copies of what was in the light rooms, except without these coils of rope blocking your paths, and with sometimes a few more sprites added. So basically, if you pay attention to the room before you go down the ladder, you know exactly what you're getting into and can figure it all out. This room with these 3 electric slimes here is your last chance to grind dust if you're running low on the run. In this case, we've already got more than enough, so we don't need to do any grinding here. And you would prefer not to grind that room because it's a little slow to grind, but it's good to know where your last chance is. Here is another boss that we can skip. We peek our head out slightly to activate this mini-guam and then shoot it at the boss. And that will do it for Loop 1. We have 55 dust, which is more than enough. So we're going to go turn this dust in, turn these cards in, and get on with Loop 2. Clear the storm above the city so that we can explore more. We have another right scale clip, as I mentioned, to get out of here. This is, in my opinion, the hardest one to do because it's a very shallow angle. Following this, we have a pause glide, so pause glide incoming. Pause glide over. Now we're going to turn in cards, then turn in dust, then talk to the center. You have to do those in that order. The prism can't hold any more dust right now until you reinforce it with the cards. So, and definitely make sure to talk to the center. I have had runs go badly because I've forgotten to talk to the center when I was learning this. I think everyone that's run this has done that at least once. With the storm clear, we can start exploring the parts outside the city and start Loop 2. Some things that are different in Loop 2. There are only 3 2D areas. There are also cards. We still need every card we can get. There are now 8 cards, and some of them are in chests in 3D now. Some of them are in side chests in 2D, and then you still have one at the end of each 2D segment and the dust crystal. We're just going to sit through a short cutscene at the top of the elevator here. And here's our third and final ride skill clip of the run. We're going to clip through this fence to get into this car wash area. And the reason we're going over here is because there is a chest tucked away in an alcove here that has a card in it. And then we have, followed by the longest and most important pause glide of the game. So, pause glide incoming. Pause glide complete. That skips a rhythm minigame and a bunch of dialogue, because we're actually entering this 2D section from somewhere we're not supposed to be yet. So this is Jeff Agrasite. The gimmick here is we're going to make 2 passes of this area. The first is this kind of dead version of the area where we have these dusty gravestones that we need to clean the dust off of and then read all of them to open the path forward. Then we're going to make a second pass through this a little bit later that has the living version of this, where the gravestones are replaced with people that we have to talk to. We are making 2 passes through here, so we're going to pick up a key on the first pass, and if you wanted to use it now, you'd have to actually backtrack a fair bit, but since we're going to make a second pass, we can just save the key for the second pass, which is precisely what we're going to do. So you can see we're now on this rock structure that we glided over to earlier. This is how you're supposed to get here, is by going through the 2D section first. We skipped a lower entrance into 2D and are now just... You would think entering the same spot into 2D would result in getting to the same place, but it's not quite the same place. We're now in the living version. All the places that were gravestones are now people. There's some extra people too, but we only need to talk to the people that were formerly gravestones. We're going to make a detour here to turn in that key and go get a card that's at the end of this side path. Again, we need all of the cards, so we need to have 12 cards by the time we get to the end of this set of 2D areas, the end of Loop 2, basically. Other than that, there's not a whole lot left to say about this area. We just talk to the people and walk to the end. The only other thing to note is that our tank has been upgraded, so we can now hold 90 dust. And dust crystals are now with 36 dust. Now, by the end of Loop 2, we need to have 200 dust. If you've done the math, you know that we need to turn in dust at least 3 times, since our tank only holds 90. But there's only 3 2D areas, so we're going to turn in dust after every single one of the 2D areas. This here is where we were supposed to enter Jeff by talking to this NPC here and then doing our normal spark and rhythm minigame thing. We are heading back to turn in our dust, but there is a card to pick up along the way first. Which also means there are a bunch of pause glides in this section, 3 in a row coming up. So I'll let you know, I'll call them out individually. Pause glide number 1 here, over to this ledge. Pause glide number 2 over to the waterfall. And then we climb the rest of the way up the waterfall and open the chest in the cave behind the waterfall. And then we do pause glide number 3 to get back to the freeway. Pause glide done. With that out of the way, we can now go upgrade the prism. We need to go ahead and upgrade it at least once, so might as well do that now. We can go turn in our cards Then we'll turn in the dust. There's actually a new dust drop-off spot at the top of the elevator, so we'll use that on our way back. This is also a good place to explain why we use camera speed 150%. So, whenever you turn into a car, instead of facing whatever direction you were facing before, you automatically are facing the direction that the camera is currently facing. That means if you want to turn into a car to go somewhere, the camera has a better turning radius than the car, especially at camera speed 150%. So your best bet is to rotate the camera to face the right direction first and then turn into a car. It's a small thing, but you might as well, because, you know, every frame counts, right? Anyways, now that we've turned into our dust, we're on to Iwasaki. We have another couple of pause glides coming up here. There's a lot in this short section of the run. First, to get over this log to a lake over here. So pause glide incoming. Pause glide done. Then we need to shoot this thing at the bottom of the lake, which turns out to be a pipe that leads us to this sub area where we're going to do another pause glide to skip a bunch of platforming. Pause glide incoming. Pause glide complete. And then one last one. Pause glide incoming. Pause glide complete. That last one you have to really kind of mash pause to get in. So we have here Iwasaki Antemon. There's not really a mechanical gimmick to this area, but there's a thematic one of ice. Everything is covered in snow and ice, and you have snow-themed enemies. It doesn't particularly impact the gameplay. There's not like ice physics or anything. Something to note here is there's not a lot of dust naturally in Loop 2. So to make sure that we have enough by the end, we're actually going to grind a little bit at the beginning of Iwasaki, because there's a spot right at the beginning where it's very convenient to do so. So we grind up to about 20 dust before we move on, which only usually takes a few screen reloads. Yeah, 5 screen reloads is pretty good for that dust grind. There's not a whole lot to say about Iwasaki. We're mostly just doing this as intended, but quickly. We are going to make a detour for a key here. We're going to need both keys to be able to access a path that has a card on it. The only other thing I want to note here is we do make a safety save here, because this is one of the few spots in the game where your health actually matters. For the most part, you can be pretty reckless with your health, but here and a couple other spots later are spots where you could get into trouble if you're not careful. So we take a safety save there just to be safe. Notably, these snowmen enemies actually explode and deal 2 points of damage rather than everything else that deals 1. So that's part of why this area is a little bit more dangerous than anything else we've done. We have another brief transition to 3D before we get to the end of this area. It has to do with the story of this game, which I'm not really going into the story here. If you want to know the story about this game, highly recommend you play it yourself. In my opinion, the writing is one of the best draws to this game, and obviously any sort of speedrun is not going to do that justice. I highly recommend you play it yourself. It's out for PC, all consoles. Cannot recommend enough. Anyways, that's going to clear Iwasaki here. Getting out of Iwasaki's area is actually tougher than it looks. It's something that for the longest time I would lose a bunch of time getting out of this sub-area. In particular, knowing exactly which path to take to get back to the center quickly. It gave me a lot of trouble, always. We are, of course, going to go turn in dust again. We should make note of how much dust we have at the end of this. So we filled our prism to the maximum it can currently hold, which is 150. That means we need to have 50 in our tank by the end of the next section. We already have 2 in our tank, and the crystal is going to be worth 36. So that's 38 guaranteed, which means we need to find only 12 more from enemies in the next section. Pause glide incoming to get over this gate. Pause glide done. And with that, we're going to get on to Clonway here. So Clonway is a robot created by Lawnway. The gimmick for this area is this shadow clone. So the shadow clone does a bunch of different things. It mirrors your movement, so it'll go up with you or down with you, depending on how the room is oriented. It'll match you in one direction and then be mirrored in the other direction. Basically, like there's a mirror across the middle of every room. It can interact with shadow buttons that you can't interact with. There's red goo that it will die if it walks into, at which point you usually have to reset the room. It can turn spikes into spike enemies into shadow spike enemies that can interact with shadow buttons and die if they touch the red goo. And it will block your path at certain points in this area. All of this put together means this ends up being the most precise and most difficult to do quickly portion of the second loop, at least in my opinion. So as I already mentioned, we need 14 dust in our tank, including the 2 that we already had, so 12 more. That's an amount that's pretty trivial to get in this section, so I'm not worried about dust at this point in this run. And at this point, any extra dust doesn't help us, because our tank is going to get completely empty and completely reset by the time dust matters again in this run. You can kind of see where the precision of this area comes from in making sure that you walk in a way that your clone goes exactly where you want it to and doesn't get destroyed, but also that you complete the things that you need to complete. It takes a lot of getting used to. Not really much more to say about this area, so just sit back and enjoy the gameplay. that's the end of Clonway. We have a little bit of extra dust, but that's not a big deal. As we get out of Clonway here, there's one more card that we have to pick up in 3D before we have all the cards we need. To get there, we're going to climb up to the top of this building, jump over to a mountain range, and then do a very slow pause glide from the top of this mountain range. So, very slow pause glide incoming. Pause glide complete. So, now that we have Loop 2 done, it's time for a big tonal and gameplay shift. I'm going to go ahead and start explaining the next section because there's a lot to explain. So, we're going to hit the next section and we're going to be staggering and falling over. And that staggering and falling over animation is very slow, and so we want to avoid it as much as possible. You stagger, you fall over, you do this recovery animation, and then you move slowly for 8 steps. During those 8 steps, you can't transform into a car, and then you can transform into a car and you kind of move like normal. But there's a catch. You're on a timer during that time. At the end of that timer, you fall back out of car form and fall over again and have that slow recovery animation. So there's a catch to that catch, in that if you screen transition before the timer runs out, the timer resets. So in this room in particular, we need to make a very tight line to get to the other end of the room before the timer runs out. You can actually hear the detransformation sound effect as we screen transition. We just barely make it. We're going to do some pause spam here to get over this railing without dropping out of car form. So, pause spam. Pause spam done. And with that, we've gotten through this set of 3 screens without dropping out of car form at any point. Now, there's a cutscene here that forces us to drop out of car form. When we get out of this cutscene, we're going to fall over, stand back up, walk 8 steps, then turn into a car and get to the tower. And then once we're in the tower, we can't be in car form anymore. Going to this tower, we're going to actually fall up the tower. This yellow sigil here will invert the tower. As we're falling, we're trying to avoid these red platforms because they're actually bouncy platforms that will bounce you back into the air if you touch them. Obviously, since we're trying to get to the top of the tower, touching these as we fall up the tower is slower. At the top of the tower, there's a very precise jump we do jumping into the screen transition. That's to avoid another falling over animation. If you do it just right, you can actually hit the screen transition in midair. Then as we go up the outside of the tower, the timer doesn't tick down while you're in the air, so we jump like crazy, getting up the outside exterior of the tower bit here. Our goal here is this fruit on this tree, but then a dog eats it. And then this dog is going to jump around seemingly at random, but it's not RNG. Very little in this game is actually RNG. So I know exactly where it's going to be and what order it's going to go all these spots in. Now we've entered Dustbound Village. I'm going to talk about spawn displacement here. In 2D cutscenes, if you hold a direction as you spawn into them, you'll get moved away from the starting location that you're supposed to be at. There's a couple of spots where we can use that to actually get a head start on moving towards our destination. Right here is an example of that. We're supposed to start next to the bed here. We actually start closer to the NPC here and closer to the exit to this room. We do that a couple of other spots in the Dustbound Village segment. Dustbound Village as a whole is is a very different feeling segment from the rest of the game. It kind of feels like your character is starting a new life here with a new routine. And as part of that routine, we're going to repeat a couple different types of sections multiple times. So we're going to do what I call gardening sections, ritual sections, and wrestling sections. And I'll call each of those out as we get to them. We do gardening twice, we do the ritual 3 times, and we do wrestling 3 times. Here's another instance of spawn displacement. And here's the first gardening section. This is an action section that works like the other 2D sections that we've seen. Gardening 1, as I call it, is actually one of the few other places where your health really kind of matters in this game. And that's mainly because the strategy for this second room here is to just sit there and take hits while you wait for the shooter at the top of the room to kill the other enemies. From here we're going to do Ritual 1, which first involves walking over to the train station and taking the train back to this shrine area you saw before. The shrine, it's really more of a playset than anything. The ritual is throw these dice, walk across the rickety bridge, and then send something of significance down the slide. And it's pretty much the same all 3 times. The only difference is the text that goes with it, which you can't read because we're skipping all the dialogue. But then we have the wrestling section here, Wrestling 1. So the wrestling sections are essentially boss fights, but with completely different mechanics from the rest of the game. You're actually trying to do fake hits, because it's wrestling, it's not real. So the idea is you hit near your opponent to make it so that they can fake a good hit. You're essentially pulling your punches. Then you do the same thing for your opponent. Then you have these quick time event sections, like you see here. And then the only other unique section is there's a part that I call the DDD section in Wrestling 3, which will make sense when you see it if you've played any Kirby game ever. Gardening 2 here is another pretty straightforward action section. Not much to say about it. This is the final gardening section. There's only 2 gardening sections. Following Gardening 2 is Ritual 2. Then following Ritual 2 is Wrestling 2. This portion is known as Dustbound Beatdown, which I only mentioned because I think it's a cool name. Wrestling 2 consists of 4 phases. Phases 1 and 3 are this back and forth where you hit Drem, Drem hits you, you trade blows. Phase 2 is a quick time event, and then Phase 4 is the finishing act of the match, where you end up shooting Drem to stun him, and then pick him up with your vacuum cleaner and shoot him out of the ring. My strategy for these wrestling sections is I actually shoot just off to the side of the target to make sure I get the correct hit. The way it's supposed to work is you press the button to fire, you hold the button down, and then you let go of the button when the projectile is near your target. I instead usually just tap the button and aim it so that it's going to go next to the target, and that way I have a much wider range of like how long I press the button for. If you point it directly at the target and it actually hits them, you actually lose score and take longer in the wrestling section. We have some cutscene here. There's a lot of cutscene in this portion of the game and a lot of dialogue, which is our dialogue options really come into play during the Dustbound Village portion, especially because there's a lot of text involved. Here we've got Ritual 3. This time the important thing we send down the slide is ourselves. Again, if you're actually following along with the story, it's all very thematic, but to do that, I would recommend playing the game yourself. So here's Wrestling 3. It starts with the same sort of back and forth we had in Wrestling 2. Then we have a quick time event like we had in Wrestling 2. And then we have what I call the DDD section, where Drem jumps around and every time he lands, makes a pair of stars around him, and then you inhale the stars and shoot them back at him. Exactly like King DDD fights in every Kirby game ever. My trick for doing this quickly is using strafing. So there's actually a mechanic in this game that's not really documented anywhere, but if you hold the A button in 2D, you will stay facing the same direction. So it lets you make small adjustments without changing which direction you're facing, and that's how I latch onto those stars so quickly. With that done, we now have the longest cutscene in the game. We have a solid 2.5 minutes cutscene here, and that's with all the dialogue cut down as quickly as it can be. As you can see on my splits on the right side of the video, the next segment we have up here is a dust grind. The end of the loop 3, we need 150 dust to get into the final section. But we are going to pick up 0 dust naturally and only 1 dust crystal, so that's 36. Our tank holds 90, so we need to completely fill our tank once and get 60 dust in our tank a second time. So we have a section here that's just dedicated to getting 60 dust in our tank. It turns out the fastest place to do that is going back to Clonway. It's just closest to where we start and has a spot near the beginning that is fast to grind. We do have another pause glide to get back to Clonway here, since we didn't open this gate earlier, so we need to glide over it again. So, pause glide incoming. Pause glide complete. Unfortunately, again, dust drops are RNG, so this could take a varying amount of time, but it's usually not too bad. And now we grind. I actually get a little bit unlucky with the dust drops here, but you can see even with a little bit of bad luck, it still doesn't take too long to get all the dust we need. Now we're going to actually open this gate. Now that we won't be going through it ever again, but that's the fastest way to get out, is to open the gate. And we turn in our dust. And now Loop 3 can truly begin. So, our goal has changed. We need to get a color for that dog that we met earlier in order to form a deeper connection so we can get back to Dustbound Village inside of the dog. And we also need 150 dust. The color is a base and 3 color pieces. The 3 color pieces come in 5 different chests, and the first 3 of those 5 that you open have the color pieces in them. So we're going to go after the 3 chests that are the fastest to get. The first of which is in Desert NPC here. This is sometimes referred to in the community as meeting the dolphin. This is all going to look very strange and glitchy, and it's 100% intentional. And also, we're going to have to go through this entire segment here, but as it turns out, it is the 3rd fastest collar piece to get. The 2 that we don't get are also things where you have to go through an entire section to get, but they're much longer sections. The other interesting thing to note is this is where we truly diverge the different routes, the different speedrunning routes. Everything up until this point is the same. Basically, you have to go through all of Loop 1 and all of Loop 2 in pretty much exactly the same way. And then Loop 3, it's like you actually get the flexibility to do what you want. For any percent, that just means rushing for these color pieces and dust. All cards would be going and doing all of these sections and getting all of the cards here, as it would sound. And yeah, now we have this random, weird isometric section. This is supposed to feel weird and out of place and completely different from anything else that's going on. You have this set of seemingly random-looking pathways leaving the apartment building. It does matter which path you take, in that you get 1 fewer screen if you take the correct path. so you get 6 screens instead of 7. It saves a little bit of time if you know the path. That said, it's not the end of the world if you accidentally go the wrong way. I think in my world record run, I actually do take the wrong path, and I mean, I still got world record, so not the worst thing that could happen. The only other thing to note here is at the end of this, there's what's supposed to be this kind of horror section. So you'll see a gargoyle in the hallway right now. That gargoyle is supposed to chase us, but because this is so different, the developers were kind enough to give you an out if that's too stressful for you, which is understandable. It's a very tense and stressful situation. But it also turns out that that out is just way faster than doing that portion naturally. So the speedrun also uses the fire escape. And that's what brings us to the end of this section. Now that we're done with Desert NPC, that's the only part of Loop 3 that we have to full clear. Everything else, we can just duck in just far enough to get the collar piece that we need, and call it good. Up next is Orb Sector 4-16-5. There's not a whole lot to say about this one. We start on the first floor, we go up to the second floor, we talk to a specific NPC that will unlock the third floor for us, and then at the very end of the third floor is the collar piece that we need in a chest. We get that color piece and then we leave. Now we have New Zealand. You'll notice in this next screen that you've seen me talking to these various tree NPCs. And there's 5 of them. You have to talk to them in a specific order to unlock New Zealand. I've just been talking to them as I navigate through the screen multiple times. But finally, we can talk to the last one and enter it like we have every other thing. We have a rhythm mini game. So the immediate 2D section that you'll see here will look very familiar to you if you've ever played Anodyne, the prequel to this game. It looks exactly like the Nexus from Anodyne 1, and there are lore reasons for that I won't get into, but it's worth noting that in addition to being a callback, the NPC here gives you a new power-up that you can use as soon as you enter New Zealand, called Pico Spark. So we've been using a spark power-up in 3D to shrink down and enter things into 2D. Now we have a spark that we can use in 2D to shrink down even further and get these Atari graphics looking sections. We use it a couple of places. We have to use it here to unlock the exit, and then we use it several times in the final dungeon. We have this cool medieval looking area that we're going to completely ignore everything that's supposed to be happening here, and instead make a beeline for the collar piece and a spot where we can grind a lot of dust. Here's the collar piece. And it'll be pretty obvious why we picked this spot to grind dust. Usually about 2 screen clears of this room gets you all the dust you need to finish out the run. As a reminder, we're looking to get a full tank, full on 90 dust, because we got 60 earlier in our dust grind, and we need 150 by the end. There we go, 90 dust. And with that out of the way, we can just leave. So all we have left to do now is pick up the collar base and then head back to the tower, because the dog is still at the top of the tower. We're going to pause glide over to the collar base here. Pause glide incoming. Pause glide complete. Now, unfortunately, I do overshoot this pause glide a little bit and end up having to climb this structure in the intended way, which does lose me about 15 seconds, but in the grand scheme of things, it's not that big of a deal. It's certainly not a run killer or anything like that. But now we have the collar base, and we can go back to the tower. We have to climb the tower again. And then we get to pet the dog. Not only can you pet the dog in Anodyne 2, you actually are required to do it in order to get the good ending. So we're here to revisit Dustbound Village to see what all of our friends are up to. And as it turns out, our friends don't remember us at first. But then we discover that some of our friends survived the cleaning up that happened to Dustbound Village. And that's where we start to get the idea that, hey, maybe these people that we've been working for the entire game are not the good guys. And that's what inspires us to get to the final dungeon. That final 2D section is the longest and most difficult 2D section of the game. Nano Cleaner Zera. And that is where we're going to finish out this run. We've got to fall down the tower again. And now we're just heading back to the center to turn in dust, and that's also where we confront the center. So here we are, turning in dust. $150 as expected. And then we have this brief dialogue gag where the game asks you, are you sure you want to do this? But are you sure? But are you really sure? You can see me button through a bunch of confirmation dialogues very quickly. Anecdote about this cutscene: do not touch the D-pad during this cutscene. You can walk yourself out of a follow-up cutscene trigger and end up with a black screen and lose a run that way. I am speaking from experience on this. Would not recommend it. And say goodbye to 3D, because we're going to be in 2D for the rest of the game. So, Nano Cleaner Zera has a couple of new gimmicks. First up are these pink cilia things that will destroy enemies and damage you if you touch them, but you can also shoot them with the Pico Spark to clear them out of the way. Then they have these bubbles, which protect the enemies that are encased in them, but you can use the Pico Spark to clear the bubbles. And then they have these boomerang enemies, which work like you would expect a boomerang enemy to. You shoot them out of your weapon and they come back towards you. And all of these get combined in various interesting ways. Worth noting that this is another spot in the run where your health actually matters. You can die here, so it's worth it to take some safety saves in a marathon sort of setting. Less for the save and more for the full heal that comes with it. Because usually if you heal somewhat regularly, you're not in any danger of actually dying, but if you try to push your luck and don't double back for a save point, that's where you can get yourself in trouble. I've had runs die to literally dying in this area. The goal of Nano Cleaner Zera is to destroy the 3 treasures, parts of a balanced breakfast that we got way back at the very beginning of the game. We're trying to free the next Nano Cleaner from the vicious cycle that is everything we went through this game. There is one other unique gimmick in this area, which is these blood gates here. Basically, to open these gates, you have to take damage. That's all there is to it. But the rooms are set up such that taking damage is actually a challenge. You'll see me get pretty low on health, but you go in fully healed, and by the end of the section, you've only taken 5 out of 6 damage, so you know you're going to be safe, because as soon as you've taken damage, the next room opens up. That said, I do pick up a little extra health just to make sure I don't do something stupid like walk into an enemy somewhere. At this point, we've destroyed 2 out of 3 of the parts of a balanced breakfast. In this room, I intentionally take damage off of this bubble boomerang, mainly to make sure it doesn't spin wildly out of control and kill the baby slimes, which would block my path. These pico-scale targets that move around the room, they're supposed to move in a square pattern, but if you use your vacuum cleaner on them, you can't inhale them, but they will stop in place, which lets you more easily get the 10 hits you need from your nano spark on the item because it's no longer moving. And with that, all that's left is the final boss. So we are going for a 6-cycle final boss. There are 3 phases to this boss, and in each one we want to get it done in 2 cycles. Now, remember, there's very little RNG in this game, so everything in this final boss is actually fixed. I know exactly what the pattern is going to be every time. You can see that I know that the first weak spot is going to be as close to the wall as possible, and the second weak spot is going to be as close to the boss as possible. And the idea is to break the arm after 2 punches. Same with the spikes that I have to shoot in the nanoscale segments. They come from the same places every time, and I always know where they're going to be, and I always know how to get the 6 hits I need in as fast as possible. You have less time to actually attack the arm with each phase, so the first phase, it's pretty easy to get 2 cycle. The second phase is not too hard either. The third phase is actually kind of challenging to get the 2 cycles, so frequently you'll get a 7-cycle final boss, but the target is 6. It is possible. There's some safety health in the nanoscale area during this fight that respawns each time you come in there, so you should definitely pick it up if you are running low on health. Yeah, you can see I just barely missed the 6 cycle there, so I got a 7 cycle. That's still respectable. Time is about to come up. Warning, there's going to be a horrible death screech. Now. And then time is when the next text box fades from the screen. Time. and that is a 1:18:17. I haven't retimed it, but it's probably actually closer to a 1:18:16 because it's always hard to, get that frame perfect timer shut off, but close enough. This time would be third place on the speedrun.com leaderboard for this game. I think it's a fairly respectable time. I am a little out of practice as of making this run, since after I got my world record, I kind of put the game down for 2 weeks. But this is still pretty good. So the normal post-run procedure is I would sit through the closing cutscene and the credits here. I'm going to do that in this video. And then after credits roll and everything's done and it spits you back out to the main menu, I go and verify the settings a second time. And I load back into the save file and I go through the cards. Going through the cards is in particular important for an all-card speedrun. It helps the moderators actually validate your run. But I do it on all of my runs just out of habit. Obviously for a marathon setting, that's not necessary. But, yeah. While we're sitting through these credits, I do have a couple ideas for possible incentives. One would be to actually play out that horror section that I mentioned during Desert NPC. Now, granted, I've played that once casually and have not ever attempted to actually speedrun it, so I would need to practice it. But that shouldn't be hard to practice at all. The more likely, I think, incentive to work is upgrading this to an all cards run. All cards takes about 20 to 30 minutes longer of a run. I haven't practiced that one in a little while, but the thing is, the first half to basically until you get out of Dustbound Village, the two runs are exactly the same. So you can practice either of them and get useful reps in for both. The Loop 3 portion of the run is where I would need to practice more, but I do also currently have the world record for that category, although that category is currently uncontested, so that's not saying a whole lot. In any case, that's going to do it for this video. Thank you for taking the time to watch this, and whether you're watching it because you want to know more about the speedrun, or you're watching it for submission purposes, just thank you in general. You can enjoy the rest of this video. I don't have anything else to say.